To begin, I am very pleased to present on behalf of C2ES our preview of the upcoming UN Climate Change Conference, known as COP23. First thing I'd like to make note of, this COP is unusual in one very important respect. Ordinarily, the country serving as the COP president also physically hosts the COP. In this case, Fiji will be in the presidency, but the COP is taking place in Bonn, Germany, where the UN Climate Secretariat is headquartered. This is an arrangement, a new arrangement that allows smaller countries, which may have a very strong stake in this issue, but may not be able to physically host the giant conference, to serve as the COP president. I think depending on how it goes this year, this is something we may see more of in the years ahead. So, turning to the first slide. Okay, wanted to lay out some of the basic context for COP23. First is, where are we with the Paris Agreement? As you all may recall, the agreement entered into force almost exactly a year ago, a year after the Paris conference and much earlier than anticipated. It has been signed by virtually every country on Earth, and so far ratified by 169 countries. Now, the agreement lays out basic terms, and parties are now in the midst of negotiating the more detailed implementing rules. They gave themselves 3 years to do that, so that's supposed to wrap up next year at COP24, which is going to be held in Katowice, Poland. The second important piece of context is what's going on with the U.S. First, with respect to emissions, despite President Trump's attempts to dismantle some core Obama climate policies, happy to say that U.S. emissions continue to decline. Our latest look suggests that emissions will be in the range of 14 to 18% below 2005 levels by 2025, well short of the Obama goal of 26 to 28%. Though we do think there are plenty of opportunities to do better than that, even in the absence of stronger federal policies. Now, with respect to the Paris Agreement, as you all know, the President has threatened to withdraw the U.S. from the agreement unless it can stay in on better terms. At the same time, the U.S. has made clear that it will continue to actively negotiate on the Paris rulebook. So we'll come back to these points. Before digging deeper into the issues, I thought it might be helpful to just introduce you to some of the many acronyms that one encounters at a COP. First is COP itself, which stands for Conference of the Parties. This is the governing body of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was negotiated back in 1992 and is the foundation of the global climate effort. This is the 23rd gathering of the Conference of Parties, hence COP23. Second acronym is CMA, which stands for the Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement. Quite a mouthful. The CMA is the governing body of the Paris Agreement. It met for the first time last year at COP22 in Marrakesh. Technically, the Paris implementing decisions are to be adopted at CMA 1. So what parties have done is chosen to continue CMA 1 through this year and into next year. And then the third acronym is the APA, which stands for the Ad Hoc Group on the Paris Agreement. This is a temporary body set up to negotiate most, but not all, of those implementing decisions to be adopted next year. Much of the action at COP23 will be taking place within the APA. So let's look at the issues. First and foremost are the ongoing negotiations around the Paris rulebook. Just one note there. You should be aware that the term rulebook is an unofficial shorthand term. In fact, these decisions will be a mix of rules and guidance and modalities, procedures, and guidelines. All of those can have a slightly different legal character. Some have taken to referring to it not as the rulebook, but as the implementing guidance. I think for our purposes, we'll just go with rulebook. Now, this encompasses dozens of issues. the outcome of which will to some degree determine the rigor and ultimately the effectiveness of the Paris Agreement. Among those issues are how the Paris transparency system will operate, how parties will account for their NDCs, their nationally determined contributions, how they will structure the so-called ambition cycle, which entails a process every 5 years to take stock of progress as a prelude to parties updating their NDCs. And these issues are spread across multiple negotiating bodies, so the negotiations are both substantively and procedurally complex. Many of the issues are highly technical, but there are also important political dimensions. Chief among those is the perennial issue of how to differentiate obligations among developed and developing countries. So one issue with COP23 is how much progress can be made on the technical issues in the absence of agreement on the more political issues. It's important to understand that we won't see final outcomes on any of these issues at COP23. They will all be adopted as a package next year. The real issue is not only how to make progress on them, but also how to capture that progress to provide a good starting point for next year's negotiations. One question there is when exactly a draft negotiating text will emerge. That may not in fact be until after COP23, but the absence of one at COP23 doesn't necessarily indicate a lack of progress. Parties will also need to decide their process for next year, including how many negotiating sessions they plan to hold. The second major focus at COP23 is how to set up something called the facilitative dialogue, which will take place next year. This is the first of the so-called global stocktakes that will be taking place under the Paris Agreement. The objective here is to take stock of collective progress toward the agreement's long-term mitigation goals, those being to reduce global emissions as quickly as possible and to achieve net zero emissions in the second half of the century. The facilitative dialogue will be an important moment because it will set the stage for parties to submit their next round of NDCs by 2020. Parties seem willing to leave it to the Fijian presidency to decide exactly how to structure the facilitative dialogue rather than getting into a formal negotiation around that. What Fiji is proposing is what they call a Talanoa dialogue. Talanoa being a traditional island term for a kind of communal conversation that involves storytelling to help build empathy and a meeting of minds promoting the collective good. What they envision is an extensive preparatory phase beginning early next year. That'll provide lots of opportunity for parties and others to provide input through an online platform, and all of that culminating in some form of high-level political exchange at COP24. So both with respect to the Paris rulebook and the facilitative dialogue, the focus at COP23 is going to be heavily on teeing things up for big moments next year at COP24. I wanted to quickly mention a couple of other issues that will be in play that are of particular importance to developing countries. First is the Adaptation Fund. This was established under the Kyoto Protocol to support adaptation in developing countries and was to be supported by a share of proceeds, essentially a tax on projects developed under Kyoto's Clean Development Mechanism. Parties have agreed that this fund should now serve the Paris Agreement, but they're struggling with exactly how to do that given its unique history and structure and how it will fit with the new Green Climate Fund, which also supports adaptation. Developing countries are deeply concerned about sustained support for adaptation, so they're looking for progress on this at COP23. The second issue is loss and damage. This is a highly sensitive issue with a lot of history. The root issue here is that even with strong mitigation and adaptation efforts, there are some climate impacts that are now unavoidable, and many of these will pose serious consequences for some countries. Back at COP19 in Warsaw, parties established the Warsaw Implementation Mechanism, or WIM, to address loss and damage. Part of the compromise there, at the insistence of the U.S. and other developed countries, was to explicitly exclude any notion of liability or compensation. Now, the WIM has been brought under the Paris Agreement with that same understanding. At COP23, they'll be setting up a clearinghouse on risk transfer, but generally it's been pretty slow going. Developing countries want to see this issue have more prominence and get more resources. Now, I don't expect very significant outcomes on either of these issues, but achieving even modest progress on them may be one of the keys to moving along the negotiations on the Paris rulebook. So, turning now to the United States, there's been a lot of confusion and mixed signals about where precisely the U.S. is on the question of the Paris Agreement. But I think if you trace all those signals back to the President's speech on June 1, there actually has been a fairly consistent thread, and that is that the U.S. will exit Paris unless it can find a way to stay in on better terms. Now, as you know, the U.S. can't formally initiate withdrawal until 3 years after the agreement's entry into force. So this time in 2019, and then the withdrawal wouldn't take effect for another year after that. And meantime, back in August, the State Department announced that the U.S. will continue to actively negotiate, including on the Paris rulebook, with a view to protecting U.S. interests and ensuring that all policy options remain open to the administration. All of this, of course, begs the question of what the President might consider a better deal. I think it's fair to say that the administration is under no illusions that the Paris Agreement itself is up for renegotiation. I think if we ever are to get to a better deal, that might be some kind of package with multiple elements, but the core element would likely be a revised NDC from the United States, something that is being actively explored. In terms of how other countries are reacting to all of this, first, it's been very clear since the moment of the President's speech in June that other countries continue to stand firmly behind the Paris Agreement. There was concern, for instance, at the G20 summit back in July that some might somehow side with the United States, but in the end, the U.S. found itself completely isolated on these issues, 19-1. On the question of a weaker NDC from the U.S., I think it may be a little more complicated. I don't think anyone would welcome it, and I think it likely would be widely criticized by the international community. Some countries don't believe that the Paris Agreement actually would allow a party to weaken its NDC, but based on my conversations with a broad spectrum of countries, it doesn't appear that any would be prepared to openly contest the legality of lowering the NDC. This is not a debate they want to have out in the open. I think the bottom line, at least for now, is that countries would much rather the U.S. stay in with a weaker NDC than pull out altogether. In terms of the U.S. presence at COP23, as always, we will see both an official and an unofficial U.S. presence. On the official side, we'll have a team of negotiators led by a career diplomat, Thomas Shannon, who's the Undersecretary for Political Affairs at the State Department. Mr. Shannon is new to these issues, but is highly regarded. There had been speculation about whether Scott Pruitt would be going. I'm not sure there's any final official word there, but we are hearing that he will not be going to the COP. So it would appear that the U.S. will be presenting a reasonably friendly face, likely not looking to make mischief over there, probably taking a lower profile than in the past, but there to actively negotiate. In terms of the unofficial presence, we will see a very strong contingent of so-called non-state actors, governors, mayors, companies, NGOs, and others, who will be there wanting to demonstrate to the international community that U.S. commitment and action on climate change remain very strong. Much of that activity will be taking place at the Climate Action Center organized by the We Are Still In Coalition, and there's a link on the slide here where you can find the full list of events. So to sum up, COP23 is largely about teeing up COP24, which will be the next major milestone in the global climate effort, both because it's the time when parties are supposed to adopt the Paris rulebook, but also because it will be the time for the facilitative dialogue. I think the most important outcome at COP23 will be making good progress on the rulebook, though that progress may be hard to gauge given the nature of the process and the lack of formal outcomes on that. The U.S. will be there to keep its options open, which includes avoiding any decisions that would make it harder to stay in the Paris Agreement, but I think we will likely leave Bonn with just as much uncertainty about the long-term prognosis for the U.S. staying in or leaving. We've included here some links to some additional resources that you may find helpful, and I will wrap up there and look forward to your questions.
This is Alec Gerlach. If you would like to ask a question, you'll see on the panel on the right side of your screen, there is a raise hand option on that little tab on the left. You can raise your hand and I can unmute you for your question. I'll give you a moment to queue up those questions. Lisa Friedman from the New York Times. Hold on. You're unmuted.
Okay, now I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Okay, great, thanks. Thanks for doing this. Can you talk a little bit more about what you expect the attitude toward the U.S. to be? I mean, we've heard from the ambassador from Fiji that the U.S. Engaged very positively. I feel like there's a lot of negotiators and leaders who are trying to kind of act like this is all normal, and it just can't be. I mean, what kind of reaction do you expect to the U.S. When they ask for things like transparency or or any of their interventions, when they're on the other hand, saying that they're going to pull out?
Well, just reflecting on what I observed at the ministerial in Fiji, there was only the very most oblique reference to the situation with the United States. One or two parties referred to the geopolitical context, which I think was code for that. There really was no open discussion of the situation with respect to the United States. I would expect that the U.S. positions on the issues being negotiated would really not be much different at all from where they were a year ago. And I think a number of countries would actually welcome continued U.S. support on those issues. So with respect to transparency, like you mentioned, the U.S. really has been at the forefront of pushing for strong transparency rules and avoiding any stark differentiation in how those rules are applied to developed and developing countries. I think one of the significant risks of a U.S. withdrawal is losing the U.S. voice in those discussions because there really is no substitute for the U.S. In these negotiations. So I think other developed countries who share those positions will be glad to have the U.S. voice still at the table on those issues. I think that probably what you're detecting is that countries are being careful not to antagonize the U.S. And provide any reason to tip the scales toward withdrawal. So if the pre-COP ministerial is any indication, I don't think that we will see countries going out of their way to be critical. They understand that the question of staying in or leaving is an open question, and they too want to leave open the option for the U.S. to stay in.
Thanks so much.
And again, if you have a question, please use the raise your hand tab on the left side of the dialog box on your right. You can also enter questions in the text box in the chat below. Chris Holly, I know you're trying to ask a question. You can either email me your question or enter your audio pin. All right, we'll hopefully get Chris figured out in a moment. In the meantime, we have Don Reeves of Insight EPA, and I'll unmute you right now.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
You can.
Hi, great. So I wanted to ask Elliot, first of all, thanks for doing this. In terms of the U.S. ability to negotiate, can you say a little more what you know about the chief negotiator? You said he's new to the issue. Like, it seems like that's kind of a lot to come up to speed. Like, what kind of support does he have over at State, if you have any idea? And also, I wanted to ask you your thoughts on kind of U.S. credibility in negotiating the rule book when our future presence is kind of unknown at this point. Is there a tension there?
Yeah, I'm afraid I haven't had a chance to find out much more about Mr. Shannon than what I've already described. I mean, I've heard very good reports about him. He appears very well regarded both within and outside the State Department. Now, as the head of delegation, that's a ministerial level position, and often it is largely about offering public statements on behalf of the United States. Only when we're approaching final decisions on key issues do ministers typically get involved directly in the negotiations. I don't know that we'll really get to any of those issues at COP23 given the nature of the specific agenda for this meeting. He will be well supported by a team of career State Department folks who have been negotiating on these issues for many years. The team right below Mr. Shannon will be led by Trig Talley, who was the Deputy Special Envoy under the previous administration, but has been negotiating climate and other environmental issues for many, many years. It's very well known by delegates from other countries and is well trusted and respected. So I think, frankly, the fact that it's basically the same team representing the U.S. Bodes well for how the U.S. positioning will be received there. There's a lot of trust and credibility that's been built up over the years. I do think that the U.S. may be in a somewhat weaker position by virtue of the uncertainty over its remaining in the Paris Agreement. But again, I would just emphasize that other countries are hoping that the U.S. stays in, so we'll be open to hearing its point of view.
Thank you. And can I ask one other quick thing? Any word that Secretary Tillerson might come?
I've not heard any suggestion of that, and frankly, it would be highly unusual. You know, Secretary Clinton went to Paris, but Paris was a very unusual event. I'm sorry, she went to Copenhagen, and Secretary Kerry went to Paris. But both of those, you know, were much bigger moments than COP23. So it is not at all typical for the U.S. to be represented at these negotiations at the level of Secretary of State.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you. And we have a question from written question from Chris Holly at IHS Markit. He's asking for a little more depth on the Warsaw loss and damage compromise, e.g., if liability and compensation are excluded, how will nations respond? In what way to L&D claims?
Chris, good to hear from you, even if so virtually. Sorry about the technical challenges here. Well, the term claims, I think we're not anticipating that there will be claims, given that the way this has been approached so far is to exclude liability and compensation. I mean, the aim of the U.S. and other developed countries was to avoid what you might refer to as claims. Rather, what's been set up under this Warsaw implementation mechanism is a process to develop and share expertise. So, you know, they've set up different expert groups and working groups looking at issues like risk transfer mechanism, different types of insurance that might be employed to help spread some of the risk of these unavoidable impacts. So it's not structured in a way that would facilitate any sort of claims process. Rather, it's been structured in a way to help share knowledge and resources. But given that limited role, I think that's why we are seeing some developing countries pushing to see greater attention and greater resources devoted to these issues.
All right, seeing no additional questions, we want to thank you for joining us today. If you have any follow-up questions, please email me, Alec Gerlach. That's GERLACHA @c2es.org. And thank you for your time.